At Las Vegas's most modern training facility, Valentina Rodriguez was about to meet a legend, asterisk, but when she dismissed Chuck Norris as old male mentality, she would learn that mastery is measured by character, not chromosomes. Asterisk. The UFC Performance Institute in Las Vegas represented the pinnacle of modern mixed martial arts training, a state-of-the-art facility where cutting-edge sports science met elite athletic performance in an environment designed to push human physical capabilities to their absolute limits. The sprawling complex featured world-class equipment, biomechanics laboratories, nutritional science centers, and training areas that looked more like advanced research facilities than traditional gyms, all serving athletes who competed at the highest levels of professional combat sports. The Institute's mission extended beyond simple athletic training to encompass the complete optimization of human performance through scientific methodology and technological innovation. Recovery chambers, cryotherapy units, advanced cardiovascular monitoring systems, and precision training equipment created an environment where every aspect of an athlete's development could be measured, analyzed, and perfected with mathematical precision. Valentina "Iron Queen" Rodriguez moved through this hypermodern environment like a conquistador claiming new territory for women in combat sports. At 29 years old, standing 5 feet 7 inches with the lean, explosive build of someone who had spent a decade proving that female fighters could be every bit as dangerous as their male counterparts, she carried herself with the confident authority of someone who had shattered every barrier placed in her path. Valentina's UFC career had been a systematic demolition of gender-based assumptions about fighting capability. Undefeated through 14 professional fights, she had become the bantamweight champion through a combination of technical excellence, strategic intelligence, and finishing power that had forced even skeptical observers to acknowledge that women's MMA had evolved into something spectacular and undeniably legitimate. Her nickname Iron Queen reflected both her fighting style and her broader mission in combat sports. Like iron, she was virtually unbreakable, absorbing tremendous punishment while maintaining perfect tactical composure. Like a queen, she ruled her division with absolute authority, demanding respect not just for her individual achievements but for what she represented in the larger evolution of women's athletics. "I'm not just fighting for championships," Valentina would tell sports journalists who asked about her motivations. "I'm fighting to prove that the future of combat sports is female. We're stronger, smarter, more technical, and more dedicated than male fighters have ever been. The old boys club is over." This perspective had shaped every aspect of Valentina's approach to her career and her public persona. She viewed herself not just as an athlete but as a revolutionary, someone whose success was helping to redefine fundamental assumptions about gender, power, and athletic excellence. Her victories weren't just personal achievements but political statements about women's capabilities in domains that had traditionally been dominated by male athletes. Valentina's fighting style reflected her belief in female superiority in combat sports. Where male fighters often relied on physical power and aggressive exchanges, she had developed a tactical approach that emphasized technical precision, strategic intelligence, and the kind of multidimensional problem-solving that she believed represented the natural advantages of female athletes. Her training methodology was similarly revolutionary. Rather than copying traditional approaches developed by and for male fighters, Valentina had worked with sports scientists to develop preparation methods specifically designed to optimize female athletic performance. Her conditioning programs, nutritional strategies, and recovery protocols were all calibrated to maximize the unique physiological and psychological strengths that she believed gave women competitive advantages over men. The UFC Performance Institute, where Valentina trained, had become the epicenter of this gender revolution in combat sports. The facility attracted female fighters from around the world who understood that women's MMA was entering a golden age where technical excellence and athletic intelligence were proving superior to the crude power-based approaches that had characterized earlier eras of fighting. Dr. Sarah Chun, the Institute's director of athlete development and a former competitive fighter herself, had designed programs specifically to showcase and develop the tactical sophistication that characterized elite women's MMA. What Valentina represents is the future of fighting, Dr. Chun would explain to visitors who seemed surprised by the technical complexity of women's training programs. Female fighters approach competition with a level of strategic thinking and technical precision that's pushing the entire sport forward. They're not trying to imitate male fighting, they're showing us how fighting should actually be done. This philosophy had created in Valentina a deep conviction that women's MMA had not just achieved equality with men's fighting, but had actually surpassed it in terms of technical sophistication, strategic depth, and entertainment value. She genuinely believed that female fighters were demonstrating superior athletic intelligence and that male-dominated approaches to combat sports were becoming obsolete. The Institute's emphasis on female athletic excellence had also shaped Valentina's attitude toward older generations of martial artists, particularly those whose careers had been built during eras when women's participation in combat sports was limited or non-existent. She respected their historical contributions but viewed their continued involvement in contemporary fighting as potentially counterproductive, well-meaning but ultimately irrelevant voices from a time when the sport's highest levels had been artificially restricted to male participants. Fighters from earlier generations just can't understand what we've accomplished, Valentina would say whenever discussions about martial arts history arose. They trained in a world where half the human population was excluded from competition. Of course, their understanding of what's possible in fighting is going to be limited compared to what we've developed. That Thursday afternoon, the Institute was hosting a special symposium about evolution in combat sports, featuring speakers who would discuss how MMA had developed from its early days into the sophisticated athletic competition it had become. The event had drawn participants from throughout the combat sports community, all eager to learn from experts who understood how the sport had transformed over the past decades. Among the invited speakers was Chuck Norris, who had been asked to discuss how traditional martial arts principles had influenced the development of modern MMA and how fighters could apply classical training methods to contemporary competition. Chuck's invitation had come through entertainment industry connections who appreciated his unique perspective as someone who had experienced both traditional martial arts and the early evolution of American fighting sports. Chuck arrived at the UFC Performance Institute dressed in simple dark jeans and a navy blue polo shirt, his presence immediately recognizable but characteristically understated. At 73 years old, he moved through the hypermodern facility with obvious appreciation for the technological sophistication involved while maintaining the careful awareness of someone who understood that different generations of athletes had developed their skills in very different contexts. Accompanying Chuck were Dr. Maria Santos, a sports historian who specialized in the evolution of combat sports, and Rebecca Martinez, a former professional fighter who now worked as a consultant helping traditional martial artists understand modern MMA. They had come to the symposium as part of a broader research project about how classical fighting principles could inform contemporary athletic development. Mr. Norris, Dr. Santos explained as they toured the facility, "We're particularly interested in your perspective on how the fundamental principles you learned in traditional martial arts apply to the technical evolution we're seeing in modern women's MMA." Chuck nodded thoughtfully, his eyes taking in the Institute's advanced training equipment with obvious respect for the athletes who used such sophisticated tools to push the boundaries of human performance. The level of technical development in contemporary fighting is remarkable. The athletes training here are working with resources and knowledge that weren't available when I was competing. Valentina had been observing Chuck's arrival from across the Institute, her assessment colored by assumptions that reflected her fundamental belief that modern female fighters had evolved beyond the relevance of earlier generations of male-dominated martial arts. Here was someone whose primary claim to contemporary significance came from an era when women weren't allowed to compete at the highest levels. Someone who, in her worldview, simply couldn't understand the revolutionary changes that female athletes had brought to combat sports. "Look at this old-school guy," Valentina said to her training partner, Sophia, while nodding toward Chuck. They invited someone from back when women couldn't even compete to talk about modern fighting. What can he possibly understand about where the sport has actually gone? Sophia, who served as one of Valentina's primary sparring partners and had developed tremendous respect for her technical knowledge, glanced at Chuck with the practiced eye of someone trained to assess fighting competence through visible movement patterns. Valentina, Chuck Norris was a legitimate champion with serious competitive credentials. Maybe his traditional background could offer some valuable insights. Valentina's response reflected her genuine belief that the exclusion of women from historical martial arts competition had fundamentally limited the development of fighting knowledge during earlier eras. Sophia, he competed in a world where half the talent pool was artificially excluded from participation. Of course, the fighting was going to be less sophisticated than what we've developed once women were finally allowed to show what's possible. As the afternoon's formal presentations began, Valentina listened with professional attention to discussions about technical evolution, training methodology, and the scientific principles that governed contemporary athletic performance. Her own contribution to the group discussion was characteristically confident, emphasizing the superiority of current women's MMA over historical fighting approaches, the necessity of gender-inclusive perspectives for understanding combat sports' full potential, and the revolutionary changes that female athletes had brought to competitive fighting. Chuck had been observing Valentina throughout the afternoon with growing respect for her obvious dedication and impressive achievements. The champion's technical knowledge was genuinely sophisticated, her competitive accomplishments were undeniable, and her commitment to advancing women's opportunities in combat sports was admirable. During the question and answer period that followed Chuck's presentation about traditional principles in modern training, Valentina raised her hand with the kind of confident authority that characterized all her interactions but concealed fundamental skepticism about the relevance of male-dominated historical martial arts to contemporary fighting. "Mr. Norris," Valentina said, her voice carrying the assured tone of someone accustomed to being heard with respect in elite athletic circles. "I appreciate your historical contributions to martial arts, but I'm curious about how experience from male-only competitive eras can be relevant to understanding what fighting has actually become once women were allowed to participate fully." Chuck nodded encouragingly, recognizing the underlying challenge in the question, while appreciating the passion behind Valentina's advocacy for women's athletics. "That's an excellent point, Valentina. Women's inclusion in combat sports has certainly brought new levels of technical sophistication and strategic thinking that weren't fully developed in earlier eras. The change has been fundamental," Valentina continued, her tone maintaining professional courtesy while making her position clear. "Female fighters have proven that technical precision, strategic intelligence, and psychological toughness are more important than the crude power-based approaches that characterized male-dominated fighting. How do you see historical male martial arts contributing to understanding combat sports that have evolved beyond those limitations?" The question hung in the air with obvious challenge, though Valentina's tone remained respectful. Dr. Santos leaned forward with interest, recognizing that this exchange might reveal something important about how contemporary female athletes viewed their relationship to martial arts history. Chuck considered the question carefully before responding. "You're absolutely right about the technical evolution that women have brought to combat sports. The level of strategic thinking and precision in contemporary women's MMA is remarkable compared to what was being demonstrated in earlier competitive eras." Valentina's expression remained professionally attentive, but her eyes showed that Chuck's answer hadn't fully addressed her concerns about the fundamental limitations of male-dominated historical approaches to fighting. "Given that evolution, how do you see male-dominated training traditions contributing meaningfully to athletic development that has moved beyond gender-based limitations?" "I think the value might be in understanding that fighting principles transcend the specific demographics of who was allowed to compete historically," Chuck replied with genuine respect for Valentina's achievements. "The best insights from traditional training might be applicable regardless of whether they were originally developed by male or female practitioners." Valentina nodded politely, but her body language suggested that she remained unconvinced by what she viewed as an attempt to maintain the relevance of outdated approaches in a sport that had been revolutionized by female participation. As the formal presentations concluded and the event moved into informal discussion and demonstration periods, she found herself increasingly bothered by what she saw as insufficient recognition of how fundamentally women had transformed combat sports. During a break in the proceedings, Valentina approached Chuck with the kind of respectful formality that characterized professional athletic interactions, but with an underlying agenda that went beyond simple courtesy. "Mr. Norris," she said, maintaining proper athletic etiquette, "I hope you won't think me disrespectful, but I'd be very interested in seeing how traditional male martial arts approaches compare to what female fighters have developed. Perhaps you'd be willing to participate in a demonstration." Chuck's expression showed neither surprise nor defensiveness at what was clearly a challenge disguised as an educational opportunity. "I'd be happy to participate in any demonstration that would help explore these questions about fighting evolution." "Excellent," Valentina said, her tone maintaining perfect professional courtesy, while her eyes revealed satisfaction at having created an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of contemporary female fighting approaches over traditional male martial arts. "Perhaps we could explore how gender-inclusive fighting differs from approaches developed during male-only eras?" Dr. Santos immediately recognized the significance of what was developing and discreetly signaled Rebecca to begin documenting the interaction. This kind of spontaneous exchange between different generations and genders of martial artists was exactly the type of encounter their research was designed to analyze. Within minutes, a section of the institute had been cleared and the symposium participants had gathered to observe what promised to be an illuminating demonstration of how different approaches to martial arts development might interact in practical application. Valentina prepared for the demonstration with championship precision, changing into her training gear with the economical efficiency of someone who had spent years optimizing every aspect of athletic preparation. Her movements were fluid and controlled, each gesture reflecting the kind of technical sophistication that characterized elite contemporary competition. Chuck's preparation was notably different. He simply stood quietly in the designated area, doing gentle stretching movements that looked more like maintenance exercises than competitive preparation. At 73, he no longer possessed the explosive athleticism that characterized contemporary fighters, but his presence suggested a different kind of readiness, not the systematic preparation of modern athletics, but the settled confidence of someone who understood fundamental principles that transcended specific training methodologies. "What would you like to explore?" Chuck asked, his tone indicating genuine interest in learning about contemporary fighting rather than defending traditional approaches. Valentina's response revealed the depth of her confidence in female martial arts evolution. "Let's explore how technically sophisticated contemporary fighting compares to what was possible when training was limited to traditional male approaches." "Sounds interesting," Chuck agreed. "I should mention that my training comes from a very different era and context, so this should be educational for both of us." Valentina moved into a fighting stance that demonstrated the kind of technical refinement that characterized elite women's MMA. Her positioning was perfect for the multidimensional tactical engagement that defined contemporary competition, and her mental preparation was obvious in her focused attention to the strategic variables that determine success in modern fighting. "Please, engage as you would using traditional methods," Valentina said, her confidence in contemporary female fighting methodology absolute. "I'll demonstrate how current women's technical development handles historical approaches." Chuck approached with respectful caution, engaging with Valentina in what appeared to be a straightforward demonstration of basic fighting principles. Valentina immediately began applying her most refined techniques, combinations of striking, movement, and tactical positioning designed to showcase the superiority of contemporary female fighting over traditional male martial arts. But something unexpected happened. As Valentina executed techniques that had proven devastatingly effective against elite contemporary competition, Chuck seemed to simply adapt, not through superior modern training or systematic counter-techniques, but through an understanding of fundamental fighting principles that seemed to transcend the specific demographic characteristics of who had originally developed them. Valentina's attacks, technically sophisticated and strategically sound though they were, found their effectiveness somewhat limited by Chuck's simple adherence to basic principles of timing, distance, and spatial awareness that appeared to work regardless of the gender or generation of the person applying them. "Interesting," Valentina said, her confidence momentarily shaken, but her determination to demonstrate female fighting superiority intensified. "Let me show you something more representative of contemporary women's technical development." This time, Valentina employed even more sophisticated methodology, using principles of strategic engagement that reflected the cutting edge of contemporary women's MMA training. Her technique was flawless, exactly as it had been refined through years of competition against the most advanced female fighters in the world. Again, Chuck seemed to neutralize Valentina's approach not through superior gender-specific or generational techniques, but through positioning and timing so fundamental that they appeared to work regardless of what demographic group had originally been allowed to develop them. Valentina's perfect contemporary training found its effectiveness limited by Chuck's simple adherence to basic principles that seemed to transcend the social categories she had assumed determined fighting capability. For the third attempt, Valentina abandoned her teaching mode and began applying techniques with the intensity that had made her a champion. She employed a rapid series of contemporary fighting methods, each one proven effective in elite women's competition, each one flowing smoothly into the next according to tactical patterns that represented the pinnacle of female athletic development. Chuck responded to this increased intensity not with matching contemporary techniques or gender-specific counter-methods, but with what appeared to be effortless adherence to fighting principles that existed beyond demographic boundaries. He seemed to understand the basic mechanics that made Valentina's contemporary techniques work, responding to fundamental concepts rather than specific demographic applications and maintaining perfect defensive positioning regardless of what advanced female fighting methods were being employed against him. After several minutes of this increasingly complex exchange, Valentina stopped, breathing harder than someone of her conditioning should have been after what appeared to be a relatively controlled demonstration. "I don't understand," she said, her voice carrying genuine confusion rather than defensiveness. "Your approach, it doesn't follow contemporary training methods, doesn't use advanced female fighting development. But somehow," Chuck's expression showed only respectful attention, no trace of gender-based superiority or generational condescension. Your fighting is genuinely excellent, Valentina. Your technical development is obviously sophisticated, and your athletic achievements are remarkable. Then how? You're applying contemporary female fighting techniques exactly as modern training has taught you, Chuck explained patiently. But you're applying them against someone who's responding to the fundamental principles that make fighting effective, rather than to the specific demographic characteristics of who developed those techniques. Valentina looked confused, so Chuck continued. Contemporary women's MMA has developed incredibly sophisticated approaches to fighting. But when you encounter someone who responds to basic fighting principles rather than demographic-specific applications, the advanced techniques become less important than the fundamentals they're built on. The insight hit Valentina like a revelation. For all her technical sophistication, for all her understanding of contemporary female fighting excellence, she had been assuming that fighting effectiveness was fundamentally determined by the gender and generation of the people who developed training methods. But female fighting evolution, Valentina began. Female fighting evolution has brought incredible advances to combat sports, Chuck agreed. But effective fighting transcends demographic boundaries. The principles that make contemporary women's techniques work are the same principles that make any effective fighting work, regardless of who originally developed them. Dr. Chun stepped forward, recognizing that the demonstration had revealed something profound about the relationship between demographic progress and universal athletic principles. What we've just witnessed, she said carefully, illustrates something important about athletic development. Social progress in sports participation is incredibly valuable, but fighting effectiveness ultimately depends on understanding principles that transcend the demographic characteristics of athletes. Valentina stood in the training area, her worldview undergoing the kind of fundamental reassessment that only comes from encountering something that challenges core assumptions. For years, she had believed that fighting excellence was fundamentally connected to the demographic characteristics of athletes, and that female participation had revolutionized combat sports by introducing superior approaches. I think, Valentina said slowly, I've been an excellent student of contemporary female fighting methods, but maybe I've been assuming that demographic characteristics determine fighting principles rather than the other way around. Chuck's response showed the kind of wisdom that could only come from decades of learning across multiple contexts and competitive environments. Contemporary women's fighting has brought incredible technical advances to combat sports, but maybe the goal isn't proving demographic superiority. It's understanding the principles that make effective fighting possible for anyone, regardless of their background. As the demonstration concluded and the institute began to return to normal activity, Valentina approached Chuck with a request that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the afternoon. Chuck, she said, using the informal address for the first time, would you be willing to work with female fighters? Not to minimize our achievements, but to help us understand how demographic progress and universal fighting principles can strengthen each other. Chuck's response exemplified the humility that had characterized his entire approach to the interaction. I think I could learn as much from contemporary women's training as I could contribute about traditional principles. Your technical development is incredibly sophisticated, probably more advanced than anything that was being done when I was competing. But maybe together we can explore how social progress and athletic excellence can support each other. In the months that followed, the UFC Performance Institute quietly incorporated elements of cross-demographic training into its programs. Valentina maintained all the technical sophistication and contemporary knowledge that had made her a champion, but she began approaching fighting as an expression of universal principles rather than demographic superiority. Her competition performance continued at championship level as she learned to apply advanced techniques with understanding of why they worked rather than just how they had been developed by specific demographic groups. More importantly, Valentina's advocacy for women's athletics evolved to emphasize opportunity and excellence rather than categorical superiority. The video documentation from that afternoon's demonstration became a case study in sports sociology programs throughout the academic community, not because it showed one demographic group defeating another, but because it demonstrated how social progress and universal principles could strengthen each other rather than competing. A year later, when Valentina successfully defended her title for the 6th time, she dedicated the victory to what she called the day I learned that fighting excellence transcends all boundaries, gender, generation, and every other category that divides us. Chuck, characteristically, deflected credit for Valentina's continued success. She already had all the technical skills and competitive fire she needed. Chuck told Dr. Santos when she asked about the transformation she had witnessed. Sometimes we just need someone to help us see that progress isn't about replacing one form of excellence with another. It's about expanding access to the principles that make excellence possible for everyone. And sometimes the most profound lessons come not from proving demographic superiority, but from discovering that true athletic excellence transcends all social boundaries, recognizing that the most effective fighting comes from combining social progress with universal understanding, and that strength, like wisdom, knows no gender.